All right, welcome back to another installment of forecasting the US presidential election of 2024. Once again, I'm Catherine Urban and I have my guest, Mo Olufemi. Thank you so much for joining me again in this conversation, Mo.
Yeah, it has been not even a month. Like, honestly, it's been a crazy 2 weeks.
I
Crazy
know.
2 weeks.
It
Like,
feels like it's been 3 months, hasn't it? Doesn't it?
it does.
Yeah. So we have a lot to catch up on. The last time we shared a conversation, it was right after the presidential debate. And that was where we saw a major tide turning in the Democratic Party. And you and I had discussed what are the chances that Biden will withdraw. And we talked about that and we highlighted the months of July and August of being of particular importance. And it happened. So a lot of people, thank you all for time stamping and noticing that. It feels like a proud moment because the astrology spoke to us.
Yeah, I do want to jump in and say, as much as I take the astrology seriously, there is that practical part of your brain that's like, oh, I don't think this would happen. And then it does, and your jaw's just on the floor. Like, I remember, like, when I think I was in a Twitter space, and I saw on my feed, the letter posted in my feed, literally like 2 minutes after it was posted, and my jaw was on the floor. I was like, he literally just switched into this month and he's already like, bye.
I know. I was seriously floored because even though I had suspected it, long suspected it. And I always say to people in hindsight, like it wasn't a question of if Harris would replace him, it was just a matter of when for me. But still to see it happen at a time where it was unlikely to happen, where, we saw indications that it could happen, I was floored. I was just like blown away by the accuracy of these techniques. Like, not even so much as like patting myself on the back. I'm just like, whoa, these techniques are so, so stunning.
Literally crazy. So guys, don't sleep on those monthly charts because once you get into them, like they're just great.
It's a lot of considerations, but once you get into a rhythm, they are, yeah, they are really helpful. All right. So as we were saying, a lot has happened over the last few weeks. So we need to discuss the developments. We need to discuss Biden stepping down, Kamala Harris moving to the fore of the Democratic ticket, supposedly. We have the DNC coming up in a couple of weeks. So we'll circle back when she's picked her running mate and we see how everything shakes out there. But it seems like it's a go. We also need to discuss the RNC and Trump's assassination attempt and his selection of JD Vance. So we're going to discuss JD Vance today. We're going to discuss Trump today as well. Um, so yeah, Mo, any thoughts? Any thoughts on that before we pull up charts?
So I just think it's a little crazy. So I was actually trying to rectify JD Vance's chart, and I used William Lilly's technique of rectification. Now the issue is like what degree I should place the moon at when you initially start, because basically what you have to do is you there's something that goes on with wherever the moon is that day, and you have to go back like I think like 39 weeks from the day of birth to see like when the moon was or the ascendant was in the same sign as the moon. And then you take whatever the moon sign was for that day and you use that as like the actual rectified ascendant. Now, if you have inclinations about whether someone was born during the day or night, you flip the ascendant, right? Depending on what sect you get, like when you make that moon placement in the conception chart, the rising, right? And so the rising signs I came to were either like really late in Cancer or really late in Capricorn. And the only reason I didn't go with like the Cancer time was I was like, I think he might be a day chart for one. And for two, based on his description of his family life, and for the fact that when you look at the lot of fortune or spirit had to be like in a Mars ruled sign. I was like, this dude is malefic down. So I was like, fourth house has to be Mars ruled. And the lot of fortune has to be in a Mars ruled sign. So that's why I leaned with Capricorn. Turns out he's Leo rising. And I was like, oh, Mars fourth house, Mars fortune. I clocked it right
You
away.
did.
I
You
was like,
did. Oh
yeah.
my gosh.
So,
I
uh,
love the knowledge. I love that cool rectification
no, it
technique.
was also like the same thing with Elon. Like, because a lot of people are like, he's Aquarius rising. I'm like, no, the dude has hella kids. Jupiter is either in the fifth house or ruling the fifth. So I was like, it had to be, I think the candidates were Cancer, Leo, or Scorpio rising. That's what I narrowed
Rectification,
down for him. So
and you got it right.
I
Yeah,
was
we
like,
got his
oh,
birth
Cancer,
time,
Cancer rising, Jupiter in the
Cancer
fifth,
rising.
hella kids. Like,
Yeah, sometimes you have to go with the obvious with chart rectification. I mean, sometimes the charts can be kind of sneaky and surprise you, but like for example, what you did with like hella kids, Jupiter has to have some say in that. I mean, go with the obvious. I was kind of thinking JD Vance was going to be a Cancer rising, just because of his face. He's got a moon face.
see, I was torn, but then I was like, he doesn't seem like a person who's got the moon in Libra in the fourth. I was like, no.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, all the Scorpio, like Mars and Scorpio on the IC on the angle, that's totally the guy liner, right? Like that's kind of the goth vibe that he brings. I think that people with a lot of Leo and people with a lot of Scorpio are so interesting because there's this push pull between wanting to be like praised and seen and visible and everything, and then there's like this other really strong pull to be like secretive and mysterious and kind of more veiled and mysterious. So I always find that those two signs prominently are interesting because there's like this inner conflict that happens.
Yeah, you know what else? So, like, I was looking at the time when Hillbilly Elegy came out, right? And it's fascinating that the Leo chart makes sense now because Mars rules the ninth of like publishing and publications, but also the fourth. And he was having a Mars return, right, when this was happening. So Mars was retrograde between Sagittarius and Scorpio in 2016 when the book came out. And he was literally having his Mars return almost exact, like around the time the book would have been published.
Was it retrograde or was it
It was
direct?
retrograde, retrograde. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. And that was his Time Lord.
I don't know if it was his Time Lord, but like for the fact that it was a very active Mars transit, I was like, it's giving publishing an expose about your family and where you're from,
Oh,
allegedly, in a way that does garner praise because it's a domiciled Mars, but like maybe alienates you from where you're from and maybe family people. Like,
yeah, you get some good things with that domiciled Mars and some difficult things with that Mars, especially being a day chart that we now know. Yeah, I mean, so let's just talk about his natal chart for a moment because there's been I mean, certainly being chosen as Trump's running mate was a high moment for Vance, but immediately people started to question his strength as a vice presidential nominee on both sides of the parties. So he was kind of attacked for a lot of the things that he said in the past that were kind of more on the vile side of commentary, and also mostly for the fact that he has changed his stance on a lot of key issues. Like, for one, he was a never Trump guy, and
mhm.
he has changed his mind a lot. And so a lot of people have critiqued him for being the type of person who will say whatever in order to further their own gain. And I want to be clear, because when I talk about the moon in Libra or the sun in Leo, this does not apply to any and all people with these placements. These are more like shadow side, more negative expressions of these placements. And certainly his moon in Libra in its joy in the third house does a lot of favors for him. Like he is a confident speaker. He tends to do well with public speaking. He has written a book, he's plugged in, certainly. But this Libra moon, we could say, is what we could point to in the chart when it comes to changing one's mind. And, Libra placements tend to do well in politics because it's an art form to be able to send a message or speak to an audience that's going to try to do a good job of speaking to everyone in a way that feels satisfactory to people. So Libras tend to do well in politics. However, what appears to be like a shadow side expression of this is the indecision and being able to flip. And he's able to explain it away. He's able to explain it and come up with reasons for why he would change his mind, but it still creates a lot of distrust.
Yeah, no, it's interesting what you say because like I was actually reflecting on his Mercury placement. It's like, okay, clearly articulate, well educated, what have you, right? But I was like thinking about the fact that people perceive him as weird and creepy and all these other things.
Weird.
And I was like, you know what? I've noticed a key difference between Mercury and Gemini and Mercury and Virgo. So there's this essential dignity called triplicity, right? And yes, Mercury's doing well in Virgo. It's exalted, it's in its own sign, but it doesn't have triplicity. And it's also it's not a fluid Mercury, right? It's very good at being exact and very meticulous and detailed, but it's not very good at playing to an audience, right? Um, Whereas if he was someone who had Mercury and Gemini, totally could like work the crowd, play the audience, knowing like which parts of the details that are relevant to share with whoever's in the room at the time. So this is where it's like his exacting, maybe precise and overly articulate vision of whatever he's trying to accomplish ends up kind of not working out so well.
Totally. And I totally see what you're saying. And as well as I think we can't deny the Mars that is so strong on the angle. Like, sure, it's adhered to the IC, but this is still an angular planet. Any planet on an angle is going to have a strong voice in the person's life. And, Scorpio knows how to throw digs. And it's kind of like emboldened by this say anything or say it very literally with the Mercury in Virgo. And so this is kind of a deep cut over here, this Mars in Scorpio.
Speaking of that Mars, he has a day chart. It's the out of sect malefic, and it's hurling a ray back at Venus, right?
Ouch.
Venus is very maltreated in this chart, and it's interesting to see his stances on anything that has to do with women.
Yeah.
So it's very, very prominent in this chart. And, I know that some people have the perception that Mars Venus aspects are sexy and fantastic. No, literally no. Very much harmful. Maybe has lots of derogatory, controlling fantasies about women. We see that in his stances on divorce and abortion and saying things like women should not be entitled to divorce, even if they're in abusive relationships, because it's bad for the children, it's bad for the family. And it's interesting how Mars says things about family, right? And with Mars being so strong and prominent, like ironically, not giving him a good family experience translating to his very, very strong detrimental views on family, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's making me think too. I mean, there's been a lot of discourse about how in his book, and I just think about how his book is just where a lot of people are sourcing a lot of this information from. So I wonder if he's having second thoughts about some of the things he wrote in that book. But he apparently described scaring his wife with road rage too. And so having like a really strong Mars in Scorpio could explain something like doing something that is intimidating in order to get a result. Because Scorpio doesn't just do things to be punk and provocative, there's always a motive. Or there's some deeper rage, perhaps, that is not processed, that maybe stems from childhood, which is probably explains the source of some of that energy. But yeah, this could explain like a deep-seated rage that comes from somewhere really, really deep within, for sure.
Yes, very much so. Difficulties with, I mean, Saturn's also in the fourth as well, right? Bringing austerity to the familial relations and things of that nature. Just lots
Yeah.
of alienation from family. Like whenever I see both malefics in the fourth, there are difficult dynamics with family. And obviously, if depending on which malefic is doing better, like, and the sect of the chart, mileage may vary. But it's a very challenging aspect to have, and I wouldn't be surprised as well if just with Mars saying things about his education as well, and maybe some of his military experience, like that also further alienating him from the place he claims to be from, right? So I think that's another challenge. But ironically, with Mars casting that ray back to Venus, that being, it's weird because, okay, so Mars is somewhat being bona fide by Venus because Venus is like providing sort of like an outlet for Mars and, maybe him gaining that experience through talking shit about where he's from, like allowing him to rise to prominence. But in the same vein, Mars is still casting a ray back to Venus, right? So equally where he comes from, especially like if he's not careful about the skeletons in his closet, Scorpio placements, that coming back to haunt him in terms of his reputation, right?
Because Venus rules the 10th. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And we're seeing some of that now. And so I love what you're bringing up here, Mo, because you might look at Venus on the ascendant and think like charisma and likability, but you're absolutely right to point out how this is a very harmful aspect. I think we need to talk about the Leo sun. I've been thinking about this a lot recently and how Leo is a kingly sign, a regal sign, but it's also a bestial sign. It's a feral sign. And so many Leos experience a sort of initiation in their life. And it goes something like this. It's what I've kind of called the scorched earth theory. And it's basically when the desire to achieve something or the desire to have something becomes so, so strong that the Leo sun native becomes blind to a lot of the other variables, and it's harder for them to be strategic in order to truly achieve their aims. And this is the true difference between Leo and Scorpio. Both are extremely willful. But Scorpio is a lot more like plotting and patient, whereas Leo just kind of scorch earth, just like beelines for it, and can become very inflexible. And so I feel like based on some of the emails and exchanges that we saw from his friend in college who happens to be gender queer, and how they were very close and had like a very close relationship, but then he shifted his stance seemingly for political gain. Like he wants to achieve, he wants to live out what he feels is his birthright with Venus, the ruler of the 10th on his
Mm-hmm.
ascendant. Like he wants it so bad that he's willing to change his stance and lose friends, and even like disrespect his wife and kids in order to put his motivations first.
Yes, that's interesting. Another thing that I do want to point out as well is I don't know what it is about, especially like the US public and the sexual tension between them and people who have second decan Leo placements, right? I think of people like Meghan Markle or Barack Obama and a handful of others, right, who have placements in that middle decan of Leo. It's almost like these people can coast to high positions without needing to put in the same amount of work as other people. Not that these people aren't accomplished in their own right, but this guy has literally been senator for what, like a year?
Not long, not
Not very
long,
long. Like,
not long.
and you see he's already like potentially going to be vice president, right? Uh, I think even if like the Trump Vance ticket doesn't win, like he has like pretty much put himself on the map in terms of, exacting influence in the party. So very much so. And I thought it was fascinating what you said about being willing to disrespect wife and children, like to maintain position. And I see that the sun is, yes, receiving a ray from Saturn, but is also overcoming and decimating Saturn, right? Like,
Yeah.
not very good for people he's in partnership with as well, because I think it kind of speaks to that sort of willingness to throw people under the bus and backstabbing nature. But like, it's almost like some of the people that he partners with in general, whether in some kind of work partnership or even maritally, like they're willing to accept this sort of like influence, I guess.
Yeah. Now, there has been a lot of discourse about um his wife and like, is she complacent? Is she, like, does she know where she is in terms of what he's doing with his career? Because they've been together a long time. And something I keep thinking about is how she clerked for the Supreme Court. And I wonder if like she hopes that by, supporting him and doing whatever it takes for him to get elected to vice president, if he would eventually help her further her career goals. Like, I wish I had her chart, because I wonder if she has stake in this. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's fascinating because I did look her up, and it's very funny to me how she was a Democrat until the year they got married. So I wonder what that's about.
I wonder if they like came up with this plan together for him to like change, and I keep thinking that. I don't know why.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised either, honestly. Like if there's some political scheming that the two of them are very interested in. So that's very much in the realm of possibility, but will it work to her advantage? Probably not. Uh, best of luck to her.
Best of luck to her. Yeah, I hope it works out for her. Okay. So anything else about JD Vance's chart, or do you want to look at his solar return?
No, I mean, we could briefly talk about his perfections because I find it weird how, yes, he's going into a perfection that was ruled by the malefic out of sect into one that is now ruled by the benefic of sect, but he has one of these weird charts where the malefic out of sect is actually in better shape than the sect benefic.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to interpret that, to be honest with you.
Well, um, I guess one way that I would try to understand that is probably because he has a strongly malefic driven chart. And so he likes to challenge himself. He doesn't want to take the easy road. He wants to do the hard thing. He wants to push himself. And so this is a year where we saw a lot of that, like pushing himself and seeing some successes from that. But certainly there's going to be a vibe change when he has his birthday coming up here. We're recording this on July 30th, just a couple days before his birthday. But rulership is going to hand over to this fallen Jupiter here. And fallen planets are kind of tricky because they're fallen planets can sometimes indicate that you lose something. Abu Mashar cites that specifically, that a fallen planet ruling your year can often mean that there is some kind of great loss. And that's sometimes true. It's not always true. I've seen that play out where it does sometimes come to be, and other times it does not. However, a fallen planet is insecure. A fallen planet doesn't have as much confidence. So it's certainly not the most confident planet in his chart. Like all these other planets have nice things to say, like the sun in Leo, first house, domicile, a domiciled Mercury, moon in its joy, these strong malefics down here in the fourth house. Jupiter is the one planet that is probably in the worst shape in his chart. It does have an aspect with its ruler Saturn, which helps it out a little bit, but it is in a cadent house. It's fallen, it's retrograde. So it's really not in good shape. And this is his ruler of the year. So we'll probably,
Yeah. So when I was looking at his perfections, I was like, okay, he's going from a year where, he's probably able to sort of leverage his complicated past to his benefit to articulate something about culture or society and where it should go and, policies that people can rally behind. Totally. I could see how that could be somewhat advantageous for him. However, I do find it fascinating that Jupiter is ruling the fifth and the eighth, and it's in the sixth. And when I looked at this, I was like, okay, Jupiter's in its own decan, right? And so that first decan of Capricorn can have a lot of connotations of, I liken the symbolism to surveying the terrain to see where you want to build a foundation, right? But then also equally, there are themes of conservation that also come up. And it's interesting because I feel like all of his hyper-conservative views about society have also become very prominent and under scrutiny. And I think that his role in certain projects around promoting this type of conservation or building like a society that's built on these values of maybe hyper-traditionalist ideals is something that maybe he can leverage to some extent this year. However, it's still a fallen Jupiter and it's in a difficult house, right? It also doesn't see the chart ruler. So this is not an energy that's very comfortable for him to explore. The fifth house says things about children. The fifth house says things about sexuality. The fifth house says things about, the things that he enjoys or the people who act on his behalf as like emissaries, like who's speaking for him, who's representing him, right? I think that if people thought that all the discourse about him being weird is going to die down, I regret to inform you that that is not the case because Jupiter also rules the eighth house. The eighth house carries a lot of difficult significations already. Its ruler is in the sixth, right? And so this to me, when I saw it, looked like opportunity to both bury and like be exposed for weird skeletons in the closet about maybe some of his stances and views on sexuality, on children. And there's a lot of discourse about his views on abortion. There's a lot of discourse about his sexual interests. And when I see things like that, I'm like, it's a little uncomfy.
yeah, excellent point. Yeah, because a lot of times in this maybe isn't true for everyone, but a lot of times the things that we're very outspoken about not liking or having something against are things that we're repressing within ourselves. It's like how the old saying goes, the things that bother you about other people are the things that bother you about yourself. And so sometimes people are, it's like the people who are really outspoken about, having sex with anyone you want that have sex with a lot of different people. And yeah, so yeah, who knows? Maybe we will see something like that come out for
Yeah.
sure.
I wouldn't be surprised if there was something difficult about his past relating to how he enjoys spending his time that becomes front and center.
Yeah.
Um, I think as well, just like his views on abortion, just creating a problem in some way. Like, I feel like that's also not going away as well. So, food for thought.
Yeah. Well, let's compare this with the solar return because I like to translate the annual perfections over. So I'm just going to pull that up just for reference. Oops, I did not calculate that correctly. Here, this is what we want.
Perfect.
All right. So yeah, he's in a fifth house perfection year. As you said, Mo, topics around children, reproduction, and there's something around maybe finances being an important piece of the year too,
Oh
because
yeah.
Jupiter is in the second sign from Sagittarius. Sagittarius, I mean, if we're just looking at the fifth house alone, if we're not even looking at the Jupiter, this could be a fun time with Uranus there, maybe get some curveballs, some surprises. Like this could be fun. Like if I was consulting with someone who is like, I don't know, I would say like this is a year that you should be taking chances. You should be
Mhm.
let yourself be a little impulsive, you know. This is a year to wild out a little bit. And but that Neptune there at 29 degrees Sagittarius, that's what you mentioned, I think, about having really strong ideologies is really showcased here. And 29 degrees, there's nothing light about that. It's usually something that's really extreme and can sometimes indicate a crisis of some kind. So whether that's a personal crisis or whether because now he's on the world stage, a crisis around his extreme beliefs, because it's 29 degrees. It's a lot. And Jupiter fallen, that could be um like feeling like you're taken down a peg for some of the things that you've stood for and taken a stand for. It could also be kind of what he's good at, which is finding a way out of it, making excuses for it. So then
Yeah.
so then we want to look at Jupiter in the solar return chart, and Jupiter's condition doesn't get a lot better. A lot of times when we see a challenge planet like that, we hope to see it improved or helped in some way in the solar return. But here it is simply not helped. We've got Jupiter in detriment. A lot of times a detriment planet can be you're in unfamiliar territory, you're out of your comfort zone, you're out of your league, you're being challenged in new ways. You have to learn something new. And here, and I know you have a lot to say about the Mars Jupiter conjunction, but here Mars is afflicting Jupiter. And so there's something about beliefs. Gemini, maybe there's two different streams that he's trying to appease.
Hmm.
And Mars is going to be the difficulty with that. I also just one last thing, and then I want you to tell us about this. I see this combination, like Jupiter and Gemini, especially inflamed by Mars, as being like propaganda, like the way that words are manipulated in order to create a reaction, in order to hype people up, you know?
Oh yeah. Um, it's interesting because I find that Jupiter has connotations of truth, right? And Jupiter in both charts is busted as hell, right? Um, so I think that there's a tendency to obfuscate the truth, that's going to become very prominent this year. Um, However, unlike in his typical natal condition where there's not a lot of cosignment of that, Jupiter has triplicity in Gemini. So
Mm-hmm.
there will be people who endorse some of what he's doing. Is there still an overall obfuscation of the truth, distortion of the truth? And I find it fascinating that Jupiter's in that middle decan of Gemini because there's a slightly performative element to that decan where it's like in these contexts I play up this aspect, in those contexts I play up that aspect. Like there's going to be a lot of questions about what does he really believe, right? I find it
Yes.
fascinating that this Jupiter is in the third house, along with Mars, who rules the return chart. And when I saw it, I was like, oh, he's competing for influence of the ideology over the party. But like, um, as a few astrologers, so I know Dr. Lomi has hinted at it, Blaze has hinted at it as well. Mars, Jupiter configurations hinting at changes in sort of alliances, changes around ideology, things like that. I think you're going to see like this sort of who is he really and what does he really believe? And like maybe sort of his stance kind of exposing sort of a rift within the party. Because I know a lot of people talk about the Dems are like so fragmented, they're not unified, but it's like the whole tone of the direction of the election has changed in 2 weeks. And that Republican unity they tried to sell us at the RNC is already starting to somewhat come apart at the seams, right? And there's something about him that seems a little central to some of these narratives, right? So just
Yeah.
food for thought.
Yeah. No, excellent, excellent delineation. And I love what you said about it holding triplicity and having support through the different things that he's communicating. And oh, and here's a connection. Fifth house, reproduction. Sixth house is doctors, like medical care. And then in the solar return chart, we see, Jupiter ruling the fifth and Mars ruling the ninth. So, the law, how the law intersects with medical care. And that may be something that he continues to be very outspoken about when challenged on what his beliefs are. I think that's the one thing that they can really rely on right now is as a stance, because that is something that they get a lot of support from in the Republican Party. So that may be something that he leans on in the year ahead. That might also be shown by the moon being super angular in the solar return chart and like women's issues here with the moon. But one other layer here, Saturn.
Yeah.
One other layer here. We've got Saturn forming a square to his Jupiter as well.
Mhm.
Or rather, they're in square formation. So that adds even more tension. That adds even more pressure on him. So the pushback that he's going to get this year. I mean, this is also just telling us about difficulties that he may experience this year. So yeah, as much as it's telling us about fifth house topics, it's also telling us, as Jupiter is like regent of the year, like these are some big challenges that he can expect in the year ahead. So I would say that the year definitely doesn't look easy. And on top of that, we have this notable ascendant degree here, 29 degrees. When I see that for people, I see endings. I see significant endings, like a significant ending of a chapter. So that is coming to fruition. Now the question is what chapter is ending? Is it his relationship with Donald Trump and this relationship? Is it going to be something else? Like, would he pivot again since he's kind of a little bit newer to being like a representative? Like, where does he go from here? Is the ending because he's going to be in the White House? You know what I mean? Like, there's a significant ending to his persona, his identity, the way that he interfaces.
That's interesting because the ascendant is also cardinal. So a lot of change happening for him in the next 6 months. Um, that ascendant is falling in his ninth house. So I think that there is something about the role he's taking on this year in terms of shaping the political, ideological trajectory of the party, right? And it's almost like thinking of the decanic symbolism of the last decan of Aries. It's those intense, short-lived relationships that are able to have those impacts. It's also very propagandist, to your point, right?
Wow.
The 12th part of said ascendant is in Pisces, which is what? Natal 8. Like, so I think that even if he doesn't say get to the White House, there's a particular maybe underbelly donor class that he is appealing to, right? These secret societies that try to shape, law, culture, the Heritage Foundation, Project 2025, etc. I mean, he's probably like affiliated with all of these groups. And I think that this year will unfortunately bring to light like, what he's trying to, so he's Mars in the return, right? But Gemini Jupiter is the Time Lord. Jupiter's trying to play everybody, be like, yeah, we're doing this, but behind closed doors, I'll say this. But Mars is like a lot more, not that Mars can't be good at that either, but Mars is a little more straightforward than that, right? And what's fascinating to me is that Jupiter and Saturn being square and Saturn like having a lord that's unreliable is like, okay, this is the sort of ideology that we've committed to. This is the principles of solidarity that we're coalescing around, right? And Jupiter's like, about that. Like, we have to keep these interests balanced. So I think that with Jupiter being besieged, because it's very besieged, like
Yes.
he's going to struggle to appease groups that don't align, right?
Hmm.
And I think that ironically, abortion is going to be that issue.
I think so too. Yeah, I
Yeah,
think so too. Which makes Harris a really strong contender because that's her issue, but from the other side. It makes me think too about all the eighth house, about like what his relationship is with Trump, because Trump knows the things that Vance has said about him in the past. So, what's the exchange? Because the eighth house is always like I'll do you a favor and I want you to do something for me kind of house. So, very interesting there.
very selling your soul to the devil kind of energy. Yeah, so I mean, the thing is, the moon is in great condition in the chart, but remember,
Yes.
it falls in the
Yes.
12th. It falls in the 12th of his natal. So that's a weird place to be because it's almost like he does have his sort of, maybe he's somewhat insulated from some of the consequences of what he's doing, and he's got his tight knit network that is sort of supporting him through it. But I also find it fascinating that the moon is like, yeah, she's comfortable, but the only thing she can really see is Saturn and Mercury, and is not talking to either benefic. So that's
Yeah.
fascinating to me. So it's like, yeah, he's comfortable and he has a lot of agency to do things on some level. But there's something that's not giving him as much juice as he could really get from the return. Like even Trump has more going on with his moon in the return, and the moon doesn't have nearly as much dignity, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the way I would look at this moon is like the way he's going to end up feeling about his year when it's all said and done. And I think, he's going to feel like he made some progress with Saturn, like he's going to feel like he climbed the ranks a little bit. And I think that's at the end of the day all he really wants. When you look at his first house, he wants to be known. He wants to have influence. And maybe some of that comes from this Sun Saturn square. Like he wants to achieve so that he can prove to himself that he's worthy, that he's got what it takes. And so I think this moon says things about visibility and public favor in him. And I think he's going to feel like he did his job, especially when that moon also does make a trine to Neptune there too, if you want to look at that. Also, I mean, Neptune seems to be favorable for people who have permeated the collective. It seems to be like you've tapped into something bigger than you. And just to drive home another point that I noticed in his progressions is that his progressed midheaven and his progressed ascendant have just shifted signs. So that always indicates a major change in the person's life. So this new career for him in the last 6 months, which is basically like his political career,
Mhm.
this is a new beginning. So I don't know if he's going anywhere, but I don't see him working with Trump for a super long time. I'll just say that. I see the progressed I see is moving toward a conjunction with Jupiter. That's going to take a few years, folks. Like that's going to take 4 years about. But that says something about ideologies and being like a figure that people see as inspirational.
Right.
So we're going to see that come into play in about 4 years. We're going to see that increase for him.
Oh, he also just came off of a progressed full moon in Pisces. So
Yeah.
I think that would probably correspond to what Peter Thiel pouring money into his like campaign, basically. And I think that there's something about like making money and tapping into like a hidden donor class that's heavily implied with some of his activations this year. And it's almost like he's joining the ranks of those politicians who have hacked how to use their station or their office for financial gain.
Yes. Now, let's take a look at these lots really quick because this is striking. And this is why I kind of made that comment a minute ago about I'm not so sure he's going to, how long he'll work with Trump. um, we've got the lot of fortune conjunct Uranus. So as if this election season couldn't get even more exciting, this is corresponding with his 10th house, not
Uh-huh.
too far away from his midheaven, which by the way, his synastry with Trump is very, very on point.
Fascinating.
I see why they're working together. But that is going to indicate something out of Vance's control, something he doesn't pursue for himself. Something happens that brings some sort of flip, some sort of big unexpected change, or and Uranus can be sudden advancements, like things happen for you. I tell people a lot of times the lot of fortune is sometimes things that happen to you, sometimes it's things that happen for you. And look, it sees its ruler over here, Venus. So it's kind of a friction aspect with a square. So it's something that maybe doesn't come easily, but brings perhaps something more favorable. So there could be some kind of turn events. And I know this isn't necessarily my prediction, but I've heard other people suggest that it won't be Trump on the ticket. I've heard like intuitives and psychics say that. So don't quote me on that, but I'm just saying this in his 10th house makes me feel like anything could happen. Anything.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating because so that lot of fortune is actually on Algol, right?
Yeah.
And lots of connotations about, losing your head. The Medusa myths are heavily tied to that fixed star, someone being turned to stone by like a scorned feminine figure, right? I mean, that's also on his midheaven. So and thinking about the themes of the last decan of Taurus, right? Like, okay, you've got that energy, you've got the things that it's like the reaping and the sowing, right? Like these are the things that I've poured into something. Let's cash out on them for better or worse, right? You get in what you put out, right? So stuff like that. The 12th part of that lot is also in the eighth, right? So
Yes.
potential for, again, because he's like seeking a high station, getting connected to a hidden donor class. Equally, eighth house is the skeletons in your closet that you do not want to come out, right? And so, if there is a skeleton in the closet, such as a scorned feminine figure that was harmed, very much in the realm of possibility, right? Uh, just weird things like that. And, it could be that, to your point about what if they want to replace people on tickets, right? Because there's something weird going on with the Republican Party where I feel like depending on what happens with the DNC, it's going to affect the already fragile like coalition that they have built, right?
Yeah.
So it's very fascinating to watch.
It is. It's absolutely wild how the tides have turned. Like previously it felt like Democrats couldn't get their shit together and now it's completely flipped. which is something that Uranus does. But to your point about it being in the 12th part of the eighth, like, what if this donor, this hidden donor class that has been funding Trump too, sees that Trump cognitively isn't able to represent their interests as dependably, but someone like Vance, who's newer, and as we talked in length about his Leo sun and the desires of the capabilities of his Libra moon, he may be their new guy.
Yeah. I mean, this is where I want to bring in the lots of assistance and burden because they're
Ooh.
both in the seventh, right? Okay, assistance, being uplifted through partnerships, burden, being attached to partnerships. And I was like, that's crazy. Like, okay, literally by him being on this ticket, he's being uplifted. By having access to the people that Trump probably has access to, being uplifted. The 12th part of burden is actually in the third. And I think that this is where, again, the fragility of the party. So I think political affiliations could be like a third house thing because it's almost like a brotherhood, right? And
Mhm.
so I think that there may be some issues there. Third house, I could see negative manifestations like being related to gossip, right? And so yeah, there's a lot going on. I mean, he doesn't have a month of burden until May, so that's
May.
like longer. That's way out from the election. I just think it's hilarious that he and Trump both have a lot of burden in either in Aquarius or triggering Aquarius this year. Like,
Yeah, let me pull up Trump's. I've got so many notes over here. Yeah, Trump's is in his seventh house. So, wow. Okay. So that brings challenges for Trump this year around partnerships. And that was another thing that made me kind of think what I thought about the lot of fortune is there being some tensions between Vance and Trump. And lots of non-astrologers have suggested that as well, about how like they both want the spotlight and no one wants to take shotgun. But yeah, Trump's lot of burden is in his seventh house. So that
mhm.
means challenges through partnership. And so I was, when I first did his chart, I was thinking it's his marriage. That's what I was thinking. But
Yeah, I like marriage on the table. I thought also running mate issues or litigation. I mean, all of those things are very much on the table.
yes, very much. So it could be any or all. But yeah, maybe when we get to Trump's chart, we can highlight that.
Yeah. I think the last lot I would like to talk about is the lot of spirit, because that's in his natal ninth, right? So it's in Aries. Again, shaping culture, law, ideology of some kind is like where his sort of efforts and energy are centered this year, which is fascinating.
Would you count that as being in the first dodecatemoria or the second?
Oh, that's at 2:30. Hard to say. Hard to say. Like I'd need
Well,
to see like but I would say if it's at 2:30 on the dot, like we could probably say it's in the
in the
12th part
10th.
of his 10th. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I was thinking that too, just based on the rest of the story about how that's what he's pursuing. Like there's something around litigation with the ninth house, like something about maybe the courts, or, as you and I hinted to last time, around maybe the outcome of the election being challenged. That would certainly be a judicial matter. But, and
wait, wait, I
yes,
like that because then if Trump and Vance both have the lot of burden in the seventh, which is also litigation, right? The act of suing someone. Say they do want to challenge like the election or challenge how the courts or something are going, and they're like trying to go through all these hoops to have these lawsuits, right? That could also make sense.
absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of ninth house influence for all of these important figures right now. Like I see it in Trump's, but that could also be his personal stuff. But I see it with Harris and I saw it with Biden too. And so now we're seeing, since Biden decided not to run, he's focusing on Supreme Court reform. So I feel like that's going to be a bigger topic. We saw that in the Aries ingress to the angular Jupiter. We knew that courts were going to be a big topic this year. So yeah, maybe there's something more macro, or could it be something more personally driven? The ninth house is also like religion. Is there something that he's trying, like, who are these secret funders, of like, let's
Mm-hmm.
say the interests of Project 2025, which there's a lot of religious ideology that goes into these plans.
Oh yeah, like the rise of Christian-based fascism is like at our doorstep, and JD Vance seems to be a great vehicle for that kind of thing.
Totally. And I just want to say, in regards to that, because we are coming up on a Saturn Neptune conjunction. It's going to happen within like the first couple degrees of Aries, but we're seeing that co-presence now. And so that gave me a little bit of worry when I started hearing about Project 2025, because we're already seeing the push to put religion back in public classrooms. We're already seeing the motivations of certain ultra conservative politicians to try to kind of go back, right, to the way things were when religion had more of an influence of people on a daily life. And so, yeah, I mean, that is a threat, but it doesn't mean that that they have to be holding space in the White House in order to be influential, if you know what I
Exactly.
mean. Because I was worried about that with the elections in Europe too. And the progressives ended up winning at the last minute. And we're kind of seeing the tides go in that way too. But we're still going to be dealing with this. We're still going to be dealing with the influence of these religious fascist ideals.
Yeah, very, very, very much. I'm just looking at the last comments I want to make on his solar return, just because Venus and Mercury are both retaking their oaths, and
Ooh.
I see how Mercury rules the 11th and the second house. Great configuration for making boatloads of cash with lots of groups with a platform. So could be another political come up grift, who knows? Venus retaking her oath as ruler of the 10th and the 3rd, again competing for a public office and putting his name out there in terms of being the person, right? Yeah. I had a question for you. So I was
Yeah.
struggling with his chart. I was like, okay, who's the master of the revolution? Because I came down to the sun or the moon, because the moon is angular, but the sun is like well placed.
Okay. Was he the one that no, I didn't, I text you about Kamala's chart. I was like trying to figure out who it was there. I guess I didn't write one down, I don't think. So let's see. Because Jupiter does kind of see the ascendant,
But
but
then
it's in
Jupiter's like not doing
bad
so
shape. I
hot.
know. I know.
And then it's like, okay, the sun, we could default to the sun. But then it's like, oh, that moon is angular. Like,
Yeah, I know. That's kind of what I was asking you about, because I feel like a planet on an angle that's in good shape is worth considering. And that would make sense for him too. Like if it is the moon, then it ends up being a big year of change, which is supported elsewhere. So,
yeah. So sometimes I do this thing where if I can justify it, it's like I'll consider two planets in parallel and see which months have both planets angular, because then it's like it doesn't matter like which one I chose. Like this is definitely undeniably a month of action,
ooh, I
right?
like that technique. I might
Because
try
then
that.
because there are some years where it's like, okay, everything is either angular and domicile. Which one do I pick? Like, or nothing is angular. And it's like, yeah, pick the moon, but it's like the moon is doing horrible. Like, why would I pick the moon?
Yeah, I mean the moon's
So
pretty comfy here. I mean the sun, which would be the ruler of
the
the
chart.
natal chart. So maybe the sun, because that one would come before the moon. So I would maybe pick the sun.
We'll
But
go with the sun. Yeah,
I think the moon is a good contender though.
I definitely settled on the sun for him just because I was like thinking about the sect of the chart. Okay, day
Hmm.
chart, sun's doing well, may as well pick the sun. Like, but it was a fascinating mental exercise. I think we can get into his charts. Like,
The the monthlies.
yeah, just
Yeah.
I don't want to look at all of them because I have
Yeah.
stuff written for October and November. I just want to look at
Let's look at September. Do you want to look at
I think like
September?
August, September. Yeah,
Okay.
those are good ones to look
Yeah.
at.
So yeah, that's what I think I should have said this right at the beginning, but we plan to do one more of these installments and then we'll probably have to do another one eventually, like after the
After the
election.
election.
I'm just based on our what we're feeling.
Yeah,
We'll probably have to, but next time we connect after the DNC, we'll look from like October beyond, like we'll look at September, whatever's happening after for all the candidates, and that's when we'll kind of lock it in. But yeah, so let's look at him for September. But what I wanted to say is all of his monthly charts have the sun and moon in the same sign, at least for a while. So you could pick the sun or the moon.
exactly. You really could.
All right. So here is his August chart, which once again, we need to be careful delineating for the month when this is a chart that also wants to describe the whole year. But we can kind of make like bring it down to the monthly level here and look at the same chart again. So
I mean, again, like the moon has long separated from Mercury, the only other planet it's really connecting to. Once it separates from Saturn, like with the exception of the outers, which like when I look at moon aspects, it's like the moon's not conjunct, I'm like, whatever. Um, Pretty void after that, like not really connecting with anybody. So, until, she changes signs and goes into Leo, but that's a long ways off. And I find it fascinating that it's like, okay, the moon is applying to Saturn. Saturn in this chart saying things about, not only groups of people and aspirations, but also and potential for gains as well, but like, you know, competing for a leadership role, being more front and center, right? And so maybe there's something building up around acknowledging the limitations of an authority figure and him kind of maybe stepping up behind the scenes, just because this is also happening in houses that have connotations of being like more private, more hidden, a little shadowier. So,
yeah, his private life is definitely front and center here this month and it has been since he got elected. I mean, people knew who he was, but no one got to know his family and also his past, his book, where he says he came from. Those things are all big topics this month. And again, he is in a fifth house year, but he's in a fifth house month for this first month too, which takes us to beginning of September, September 2nd. But the monthly transfer takes us to the fourth house. So the natal fourth house is also thematic for us this month.
mhm.
Um, the monthly ruler is Jupiter, and again, it's not in the best shape here. So he's having a difficult month for sure. There's been some rumors, third house things going around about him. There was the whole couch rumor that was not true, but gave everyone a chuckle.
Yeah, I mean, and it just got people looking more into sort of again his private life, what he does for fun, like what he enjoys. I mean, that's like a whole, I mean, even though I know obviously you take certain things on the internet with a grain of salt, like that's the first rule of the internet. Um, but the fact that it stuck and got some traction in the media was a bit interesting, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Well, and his friend from Yale leaked the email exchanges. So that's kind of a third house thing. And yeah, not favorable, not comfortable for him with the Mars Saturn stuff.
I do want to say that, like, I think more of that kind of stuff will come out about sort of the email exchanges, who he was in different contexts. We're already seeing little things like that as well. Like, so there's going to be a lot more rumors and gossip and slander. Anything Mars is touching can have a lot of those implications. Mercury is also squaring Mars, by the way. Like, yes, it's stationary, but Mercury will basically be on its way towards a retrograde application. No, sorry, separating from Mars, but like it's still retrograding to a square with Mars. So
Yeah.
not good for it's giving slander of
Well,
some kind. Like,
and things coming back. So what I'm almost wondering too, and I don't know if you're kind of if you've been hinting at this a little bit too, but he's in a fifth house year, so his sexuality, and this is something that he discussed being curious about in his book. Um, would he have had experiences that he acted upon experimenting and those come out? I'm wondering if that's a possibility.
I mean, for the fact that again, he's in a fifth house year ruled by a very difficult Jupiter, a very repressed Jupiter. I would not be surprised if things came out and it's like, well, there's nothing wrong with being curious. It's like a very
No,
normal thing, but you have marketed yourself in a very particular way, which makes it look, especially for the people that you're trying to appeal to, may take
precisely.
issue with that, right? The rest of us probably don't really care what
Nope.
you decide to do with your time, but
Nope.
the way that you market yourself opens you up to scrutiny from other people.
Exactly. So that's where we have this Gemini split, perhaps, of, wanting to have both, wanting to have loyalties and wanting to say the right things to gain favor of the audience. All right.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so that could be part of where this fortune in Venus's sign. So there's some things that are favorable that happened for him this month, but there's also a wild card component here.
Definitely. And the last thing I will say is that it's fascinating that his natal Venus ascendant conjunction falls in the fifth house of this chart. And so, on the one hand, yes, people commenting on his proclivities, right? But equally, him positioning himself to sort of fight for the soul of America, the party, whatever, on the basis of how, I guess, degenerate we've become as a society. I think that resonating with key people who can give him resources, just considering
Totally.
where that fortune is falling.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And, if I was his astrologer, I would say this is a good time to maybe reveal more about your personal life. Like, tell us about your family. Like, tell us about, let's hear it from you in a present context. Let's get to know you.
Yeah, but also like not in the way where you typically slander your family because you're ashamed of where you come from, but like you had to have had like a constructive experience. So for example, it's like I think it was Tim Waltz. He made a great point. He's like, I don't know a lot of people who come from that region who were that poor, who went to Yale and did venture capital, right? And he was raised by his grandparents. So it's like there had to be something constructive about them raising you. And I know that for a lot of people who have difficult relationships with their parents who were raised by grandparents, usually the grandparents offer some kind of like constructive support. I also would advise him, especially because the moon is doing pretty well compared to other things. This is a great time to repair your relationship with feminine figures, especially maternal ones. So that's what I would recommend personally.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes. Yeah. I heard something about like how his family isn't allowed to talk to the press, like his extended family.
And we
knows?
all know why.
Maybe. Yeah. I mean, they can't be silent forever, right?
They can't. Okay, so September is interesting. So September's really weird because this is the month where the eclipses happen. And I was looking into the uh, darkening of the light technique, and JD Vance, like Joe Biden, is having a darkening of the light period during the eclipses.
Really.
Yes,
Do you
because,
think,
oh,
sorry,
go
I'm
ahead.
jumping ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So to explain it, basically, so for those of you who are familiar with continuous perfections of the ascendant, basically your whole chart is continuously perfecting. And what you do is you take the sun or the sect light. In this case, the sun is his sect light, so less work to do. You look at when it perfects to the 12th part of a whole sign angle, and if there's an eclipse happening during that period, it is said to be a darkening of the light. Um, so he has that for these eclipses and the next eclipses coming up in March. So, but it's weird because technically this month he has a month of joy because in his natal chart, Mercury is the ruler of his lot of spirit, and spirit is conjunct fortune.
Mhm.
So I'm having mixed feelings about how to interpret the month for him, just because it's like there's some good qualities, obviously, but then there are also some not great qualities.
Yeah. So, yeah. All right. Well, let's break it down. So we're in a sixth house perfection month. It's ruled by Saturn.
Uh-huh.
That Saturn is pretty strong in his chart. Not that it has a lot of dignity. I don't think it has any, no. Um, but it's an angular Saturn. So that Saturn is ruling the month. The monthly transfer now syncs up. So he's also in a sixth house um signification through that. Um the thing I was gonna say, where was I? All right. So he is in that Capricorn ruled month. This is
Uh-huh.
where his annual Time Lord lives. So Alomi said something about this being a momentous period. So I've just started calling this the momentous month. Hope he
Okay.
doesn't mind. So this is his momentous month.
Hmm.
And what I've found is that a lot of the things that show up in the solar return coalesce or are intensified during this period. So a lot of the things that we just talked about in the solar return are going to be a little bit more concentrated, and there's like a push behind it. There's movement behind it. Things are happening
Hmm.
during this period. So I think it's a very important month. It's also a month of destiny for him. So he's coming into alignment with things that matter to him and feel correct to him on a soul level, wherever his soul is. Um, but yeah, the Leo ascendant, there's something about visibility, confidence that he wants to exude. He wants to exude leadership. And you mentioned that there's a darkening of the light, and that happened with Biden when he stepped down. And there's talk about replacing him, but they would have had to do that already.
Yeah. So this is the thing. So when you interpret eclipses in someone's chart, right? You have to consider, okay, where does the eclipses fall relative to the sect light? So he makes it easy for us. Sect light is where the ascendant is. There's an eclipse in his third, and there's an eclipse in his eighth, right? But it's where the 12th part of the eclipse is where some of the main house significations come from. The 12th part of the Pisces eclipse is in that Capricorn sixth house. Um, the sixth house can have to do with a lot of like challenges. Sixth house can be subordinates, but I would argue the sixth house also has some inimical significations, and it's where people are kind of like undermining you in a way. Not people who are necessarily on your level or capable of doing damage, but maybe people who can create inconveniences or stop you from doing things that you would like to do, right? Um, the 12th part of the Libra eclipse is in the seventh, right? So there's something about partnership that is heavily implied in that experience. And I wouldn't be surprised if there is talk about not having him on the ticket, right? Or removing him from some kind of position of influence in a way that might trigger the need for litigation or some kind of thing. Because I could see
Yeah.
something where there's like a falling out or a friction, where someone during the Pisces eclipse, because it's an eighth house eclipse with those sixth house significations, where it's like there's some issue with shared resources or something that is owed or something that is hidden that is willfully concealed as well that gets revealed during the eclipse, right? Such that the exposure of the thing during the Libra eclipse leads to this difficulty with partnership, right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
requires sort of that reevaluation, if not, again, litigation type signification. And the reason I say litigation specifically is because Mars is squaring that eclipse pretty tightly.
Mm. Hmm.
So yeah, I could see that like when the actual Libra eclipse happens, it's I think Mars is at 15 in Cancer.
Okay.
The eclipse is at about 10 Libra. So
Hmm.
that feels like a potential for rift type energy.
Yes. Yeah, I'm feeling the rift. I'm feeling rift signatures in a lot of what I'm looking at. But my trouble is I'm not sure when it'll officially happen, you know?
Yeah.
Like I see a couple different windows for it, but I would say because I don't know if they have a choice. Like I don't know if they can really replace him at this point. Like I look at his chart and I see him having struggles to be liked and to be received, but I don't see him going anywhere. But this a lot of fortune in Leo and so much Leo here, which is his first house. That's a lot of emphasis on visibility. So I feel like they're going to
Hmm.
try to rebrand him or he's going to try to rebrand himself. He's going to come out swinging with something because he's not going to go down easy, especially being in like a Capricorn month too, where he may be connecting with that Capricorn energy of don't don't package me as a fool. Like I'm not foolish. I know what I'm talking about. And so there's something like with visibility that becomes like a divining or a defining event of the month. Like, is he out? Is he giving speeches? Is he campaigning? Like with Mercury here. So, and there's a
Yeah.
stationary Mercury. So, is he trying to change people's impression of him?
It's very much giving impression management. I could see
Mm-hmm.
just because Mercury and the Sun have generosity. So some people would argue that's not mutual reception because they don't see each other,
Yeah.
but they're in each other's signs. So there's almost like there's a co-signment without like actually getting to see what the other is doing. And so I think that this is one of those months where it's very much a mixed bag. Like he gets to be prominent, he gets to be front facing. I do think that with Mercury stationing, there's sort of a rewriting of the mandate, right? Just because, Mercury's also in its own terms in Leo. So it's like rewriting the way or rebranding the way in which they're selling that message of needing to fight for the soul of the party, fight for the soul of the country. I think it's interesting that this is Mercury stationing after Mars has long separated from Jupiter, and whatever damage has been done in terms of the internal shifts and alliances that we'll see within all the political parties, right? Like, because that's going to be a major shuffle that changes the entire landscape of the election. And it's going to affect both parties, to be honest. I think this is where he can, sort of use that opportunity to sort of market himself as like, this is the strategy that we're going to use instead, right? And what's fascinating is that, sorry, try not to sneeze.
You're good.
What's fascinating is that the sun, the chart ruler, is opposing Saturn. And Saturn ruling partners, like, that does not bode well for a signature where you are trying to redirect the soul of the party. And the sun is in that part of Virgo that's all about quality control, refining the image, right? Saturn has like, this is what we decided on, right? In Pisces, this is the brand. The sun is like, we're not doing that, right? And then you have Jupiter sort of trying to balance those two things because Jupiter recognizes, okay, I'm kind of responsible for Saturn, right? I've helped prop up Saturn, right? And on some level, because Saturn's in my domain, I kind of want to do what Saturn is doing, but equally, just because, you know, Jupiter and the Sun are being ruled by the same influence, which are more motivated to coalesce behind that mandate that Mercury is trying to reconfigure. Um, and just with where Jupiter is, and like I can see the more jovial influences, so the people who are the big donors, the investors, the financial and ideological powerhouses behind the Republican Party, really kind of like on the one hand trying to appease Trump while also maybe trying to like promote more of what Vance is trying to do in terms of reconfiguring their strategy.
Yeah. Yeah, because now all the all the criticisms they had of Biden being old and his cognitive sharpness and everything, now that's immediately being turned on Trump. So there may be some sort of shift where they try to just like promote Vance as the figure on the ticket who can reassure people.
I could
But
see
here
that.
but here's where I'm just a little uncertain because I think visibility is the name of the game here.
Mhm.
But the moon is like under the beams of the sun. So is he kind of being blotted out by Trump a little bit? Like, is he trying, is this where it starts, where he's feeling insecure and he needs to shine, he needs to stand out. Like it feels like this is really strong. But then the moon's last aspect that it makes, because I usually look at about like 14 degrees in front of the moon for its aspects, and it comes into this opposition with Saturn. So I'm not sure. Like I think that he's doing things to put himself forward, his presence. He's trying to embellish his presence, which would be true if he stays on the ticket, which would also, I don't know if that would be true actually if he got booted. But what you said about the diminishing of the light is curious. So
Yeah, I think that there's something about trying to reconfigure and realizing that there's an ideological misalignment and the struggle to, it's like on the one hand, certain influences in the party have kind of like tapped you, whether publicly or kind of on the side, like, hey, can you kind of like save this, right? While also having to deal with someone who has such a strong hold on how things have gone and possibly upsetting the person who got you the ticket in the first place, right?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So I don't know. The 12th part of that ascendant being in the sixth is also very interesting because it feels like a lot of slogging, a lot of labor, a lot of challenge. Again, having people
totally.
who may, having to depend on people who are supposed to prop up what you're doing and maybe being subtly undermined in some
Absolutely.
ways.
And how that being undermined and having to work extra and prove yourself doesn't pair well with all this Leo emphasis, both here and in the natal chart. So it's like we already see some of the inner tension with the alliance that he has with Trump, probably starting to bubble at this time.
Yeah, I also don't really, yes, Venus is doing really well in this chart, but she's conjunct K2. K2 has a tendency to snatch things away, right? Because it wants to be liberated from the cycles of being caught up in material reality, right? And so, again, that's another signature to me that feels questioning his role in the ticket. Like it seems like some people in the party may want him to play more of a prominent role, others may not. And I think that that's what's also kind of driving some of the tension between him and partner during this time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's put a pin in JD Vance because we need to see how things play out. Does he stay on the ticket? what ends up happening. But the next time we connect, we'll definitely look at his October, November, and maybe even beyond months.
Yeah.
So what are you feeling now, Mo?
I kind of want to briefly look at Trump, more so, less the other two charts and more so what's going on in August, what's going on in September, just to revisit that. And it'll be nice to just kind of see how that's playing with what we've said about JD so far.
Sounds good. Okay. So here is Trump's August month. If you all are interested in seeing what we had to say about him for June and July, you can check out our previous video that we did. Spend a lot of time on those charts, so go ahead and check those out. But here we are for August 15th. Let's see how things kind of pair up with what we were thinking about for JD.
Yeah, no, this is very interesting because again, we've got that Cancer rising, which is bringing up the 12th. Hidden enemies, things beyond your control. Um, I would also argue that compared to some of the other charts we are looking at, like for August around this time, he has the closest conjunction of Jupiter and Mars uh, baked into his month. Do you remember which month he is in by the transfers? I can't remember if he's in.
Yeah, so I have Trump in a Aries ruled month.
Yes.
So he's in a ninth house perfection month, and his transfers sync up with his ascendant now because he's like a 29-degree rising. So it's
Yeah.
also ninth house. So
Okay.
more ninth house themes, more litigation themes, whether it's Supreme Court, whether it's personal battles. This is a month that's very much focused around ninth house courts.
Which is interesting considering what Joe Biden has announced in terms of endorsing court
Yeah.
changes. I know that even though Trump is not being sentenced for a lot of stuff until after the election, I believe there was talk of him having some sentencing maybe like mid-September, so around the time he would be switching months, if that makes sense. I don't know if that's still going to go through or not, but
Yeah. Well, they said that since he wasn't president for during the time that he falsified the records and paid Stormy Daniels the hush money, that he can still be like prosecuted for that. There's no immunity for that. So it's more the January 6th stuff that gets a little blurry.
it's a little muddy. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the moon is having a hard time. I mean, she's pretty much, no, she's not void yet. She's applying to Mercury, having just separated from the sun. But the moon is in the sixth house, which also to me indicates like bodily challenges, health things. Like, again, not saying Trump is going to have like an assassination attempt or anything again like that, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot more discourse around sort of like how it happened or how bad it really was, just considering that that moon is being challenged by the malefics,
And that
right?
ear photo.
Yeah, the ear photo. I wonder if people are also going to start talking more about like his fitness to be president, considering now he's the oldest person in the race, essentially.
Yeah. And he's rambling a lot and kind of not making sense and unable to answer questions directly. But yeah, so Mars is his ruler for the month, and it's in an exact square with his ruler of the year. And Mars Saturn aspects are inherently frustrating because part of you wants to go forward and do things, and then there's other hindrances that are saying like, no, we got to stop, we got to wait, we can't. So this is inherently a month where he may be dealing with hindrances to some of the things that he aspires to do. So in terms of it being a ninth house month, there is a little bit of help from Jupiter, though Jupiter's in Gemini, as you've mentioned in great detail, like this whole relationship with Saturn and Jupiter can only help so much. And so what we're seeing is the issue with Saturn. We also have Venus in the mix. So this is a whole big T-square drama that's going on in August. Again, this is the DNC going on right now. So he's probably going to be losing it a little bit because he's not in the spotlight. But what could this mean for him in his ninth house month? There's a woman that's giving him troubles. Is it Kamala? Is it the Stormy Daniels story? You know, like something I've seen a lot in Vance as we get further ahead, things I've seen in Harris as we get further ahead, is this connection between the second house of finances and funding and the ninth house of courts. And so there's a lot of accusations around Harris's legitimacy on the ticket. And I feel like this is his last ditch effort to try to get her out.
Yes, I think as well, considering that that's a very unhappy Venus who's basically on her way towards being somewhat besieged, like Jupiter. Um, Ruling the 11th as well, like again, whatever's going on with the Democrats, exposing rifts within the party about the exact details of the strategy that they want to commit to. Saturn describes that ironclad, you know, maybe like Borg-like philosophy of making everyone conform to this ideal, right? Venus is like, can we renegotiate that because that's not working? And then you've got Saturn and Jupiter again speaking to that shift in alignment between people because they see the writing on the wall, right? And you already see certain people in the Republican Party, like, especially with all the discourse around these people are weird, right? Talking about, or even just like saying, okay, you need to pick a different strategy besides being racist or sexist or whatever because it's not resonating with voters. I could see that becoming very apparent. Like, okay, we can't take this strategy anymore because it's not working. And maybe that Saturn mutually applying to Mars, kind of speaking to that frustration between wanting to push ahead with, sort of performing this like aggressive, trash talky type of campaign versus a need to sort of rebrand, if you will. Like this does look like a need to rebrand and people like not being so receptive to it. To be fair though, I think that in this configuration, Venus is essentially getting the finger, right? And so I think that on some level they will be able to press on with this campaign that they're doing that is alienating voters who maybe even on some level agree with some of these things that they're saying, but feel that they're being too extreme about it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So there's something important around like like what, yeah, like their platform on basically trashing women's rights and things like that, basically. But
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know how easy of a month he's having though, because he's got Cancer rising. And not only is that his 12th house, but it also gives kind of like an energy to the month, which is kind of a retreating, protective, defensive. Like it's defensive. It has a defensive energy here. And I can't help but think about like this Saturn Venus situation and like you were saying, like the criticism that he's encountered from like the treatment of women, but also how that platform has a strong stake in the month. But there's also the lot of fortune in Pisces, which is his eighth house, which is, people donating to him, people
Mhm.
giving him money, or whether it's like his debt, whatever kind of is happening there. There's some important development there. But
Yeah.
fortune is ruled by Jupiter, though. And that
Mhm.
tends to be things that are a little bit more favorable. So I think, again, he's experiencing a great deal of challenges this month, but things again, like they always seem to work out for him.
So, you know what this looks like to me? Like a not so small portion of the party voicing the fact that look at what's going on with the Dems. We are in trouble. But being able to persist with the platform that he's committed to. Because with that moon in that little that decan of Sag, which, you know, if you look at some of the decanic imagery and some of the chart examples, the last decans of fire signs can be a little fashy, not gonna lie. Especially the last decan of Sagittarius, right? So it's just giving doubling down, and because the moon is applying, mutually applying with Mercury, I do think that on some level, in sort of redefining that mandate, I think he'll be able to sort of push towards like doubling down on, you know, that sort of rhetoric that they've committed to, right?
Totally. Yeah, I think you're spot on with that, Mo. And yeah, with the 12th part of the ascendant being connected with his third house, yeah, it's like the speech, the engagements that he does and everything like that. So,
Yeah, the splitting up of the brotherhood, if you will. Like, I think, again, no political party is safe. Like, we're like shuffling all the alignments, so God knows what it's going to look like in September. I think this is a great segue into September, actually.
yeah, totally. Okay, so let's look at September because this is after the DNC. Like, so yeah, just for context, like what you were saying here about like the oh shit moment. Because you know, the RNC was there was a lot of fire there. Like I thought we were in like Democrats were really in big trouble during that time. So the DNC could be kind of an exciting time and they're kind of really feeling it here. So let's see what happens next. So
Okay,
this is
so
go
this
ahead,
is
go ahead.
crazy because he and Vance both get a Leo ascendant month for sometime in September, which I think is very, very fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the sun is opposite Saturn in both charts. So that to me feels like, again, a tension with partner, tension
Mm.
with partner.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and, you know, Jupiter has to be sort of the mediator, right?
Yes. Yeah. And he's in a 10th house month. He's in a 10th house perfection month. This is a month that's ruled by Venus. His Venus natally is in the 12th house, but it has triplicity, and I believe a trine from what is that? No, trine from something. I think Jupiter aspects it. Let me see. Where's his chart?
Oh, Jupiter is a square, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah,
I was
His
like,
natal Jupiter is squaring.
I was like, there's a Jupiter somewhere.
However, Venus is also like right next to Saturn. So,
Yeah, not having the easiest time there for sure. Okay. So yeah, but a month ruled by Venus though, that's not all bad. But let's see
yeah,
what Venus is doing here. Okay. Well,
she's
Venus is
doing
in
pretty
Libra.
well. She's doing pretty well. I mean, she's trying, I think she's just separating from Jupiter. So,
She's basically on an angle,
yeah.
pretty close.
hmm
Yeah.
So, I think
Trine with Jupiter.
I think on some level like this does look like again kind of post realignment getting reconfigured on the basis of whatever the donors at the time are committed to. However, just looking at the last decan of Gemini there, it does look like they're going to have to like sacrifice certain parts of their platform and just double down on others in order for him to sort of make that happen. I mean, you know what's fascinating in this chart, however,
Hmm.
because the 12th part of this ascendant is in Scorpio, right? And that Mars is in the 12th. Um, the midheaven of this chart as well is in Aries, right? And that Mars is getting a lot of weird, subtle pinging, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I can't help but notice that that Mars is also on top of his natal Mercury.
Oh.
And
Yeah.
so I don't know. Like, yes, there's something about him like getting to sort of reconfigure or retain sort of control over the platform, but I wonder how many people he may have had to alienate in the process.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And that was something I was thinking about with the previous month too, about with like Mars ruling the month and Mars being kind of an asset for him this year. He has a lot of victory in his solar return conjunct Mars. And so his bark on the ascendant, that Mars, that antagonistic, fiery,
Hmm.
insult comedian, that's an asset for him. And so when you see Mars aligning with his Mercury, it's like we're seeing more of that. We're seeing more of the same. And I pegged this as being a very fortunate month for Trump because the moon is making really nice aspects. The moon is basically in a grand trine with Venus and Jupiter.
Yeah.
And fortune is in Jupiter sign. Granted, there is Saturn there. So that's a little bit of a mixed bag in terms of events of the month, some being favorable, some being not so favorable. But how does he feel about the month? He feels positive. And the moon is in the seventh house. So I think he's feeling better about whatever's going on with Vance. So I think maybe if we're looking at Vance's chart and we're like, ooh, it looks like he's has all the sixth house emphasis of like know your place. Like Trump may be saying to him, like, know your place. Like I'm still
I weirdly I could see that. Another thing that I do notice is that Trump is feeling good, but it's almost like when the moon can't see fortune,
true.
there's like a misalignment between the things he's trying to do and the things that are being presented. And I think that most of the benefit is coming from, again, like having support from donors, things that are like allowing him to deal with his finances. And also because the 12th part of that ascendant is in the fourth, like I know that he still owes money and like people do want to collect his assets, right? So one thing that I could see is that maybe he's feeling good this month because in whatever trial he had in New York where they basically can seize all his assets, there's something that prevents that from happening.
Ooh.
So
He's good at finding those little loopholes, I will say.
yeah, I do think as well, like, yes, like there's still that underlying tension with partners and anyone he has contracts with. Um, Venus is doing well. I don't like that the Lord of the Midheaven is kind of busted.
Very.
Yeah, it's not constructive, but I think that compared to Vance, I would say this month looks a little more constructive for Trump.
Hmm.
But not necessarily in a way that's translating to like, oh, like favorability in the polls,
Yeah.
necessarily, but maybe feeling like now the party is actually going in a direction that makes sense, right? Like, okay, I don't have to spend my energy worrying about outstanding, lawsuits or outstanding asset collection. There's something about that that may be getting put off that can sort of like allow him to double down on campaigning, right?
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, maybe it gets postponed or maybe it goes in his favor because I don't see, even though his solar return talks a lot about courts and ninth house topics, we're not seeing that here. So it's not on his mind this month, I don't think.
No.
All right,
Okay. What we
let's shift
really came
gears.
here to talk about.
Yes. Okay, let me pull it up. So should we just wrap up Biden a little bit?
Let's wrap up with Biden and talk about the current month and then pivot to just talking about Kamala between now and September, because I think there's a lot to talk about with her chart.
I agree. Yeah, so this is I think we talked about this month in at great length in our previous video. This is where we forecasted that he would likely be thinking about stepping down. We also highlighted this month for doing that. And it's like kind of spooky if you go back and listen to it. It's right around the hour marker of our last video. but
Yeah.
it makes sense because I see him continuing to support Harris. I see him continuing to support her um in her campaign. And I saw that in Harris's solar return too. And yeah, I want to just wrap up with Biden because some of the things that I was seeing in his forecast as we got closer to election were like simultaneous themes of there's positive things happening, like he feels like it just seemed like he wasn't winning but he was feeling okay, or things were going well but he was on the other side of it. So like for example, we talked a lot about this chart where we had a lot of nice things to say about like partnerships and things like that, but the moon is in the 12th. And I see themes like that continuing through election where it just kind of feels like he is has a little bit of sadness around like, oh, like I wish things could have been different and I wish that could have been me, but I'm supporting Harris, you know.
Yeah. What's interesting is August to me looks a lot like, again, campaigning. Um, so the
Yeah.
12th part of that ascendant being in Aquarius is third. Mars in this chart is in the third. Like, and that Mars is, where his natal seventh is. And so, yeah, campaigning for his, partner in crime, essentially. And that being sort of a major theme. Now, what's interesting to me about this chart is that Mars Venus square is a little bit rough, right? I don't know how much of this is like speaking to their dynamic specifically or his dynamic with other people he has that sort of partnership relationship with. I don't think it's necessarily his partnership with Harris that that particular square is coming up in, like considering what's happening in the Middle East right now and how um, a certain war criminal has behaved, even though he's receiving funding from the US to carte blanche carry out atrocity. I
Yes.
could see this being like more indicative of that dynamic, considering that the person in question is also a Libra, right? So, like, I think literally they have like Kamala and Netanyahu have the same birthday, if I'm not mistaken.
What?
Their birthdays are pretty close, like 20 something of October, like type stuff.
Weird.
And to make it worse, Netanyahu is an eclipse baby. So,
Wow.
yeah, so I could see maybe issues with a relationship with a different Libra, right? I
Wow.
don't think it's necessarily Harris, and for the fact that Saturn is opposing Venus, and like I said, with this configuration, unfortunately, Venus is getting the finger this month.
Yeah.
So whatever area of life Venus corresponds to, it's not going to be pretty good for that, even with Jupiter there. And I think that there's something about like the refreshing of the mandate of the party implied by the sun as final dispositor of this chart that explains why Venus is kind of getting the finger a little bit. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. And okay, so another thing here is that he's in a seventh house month. So to
mhm.
support what you're saying, he's in a seventh house month. The ruler of his seventh house is Mercury. Mercury is retrograde, so it's maybe reconsidering some things, and it's combust. So there could that indicate that a relationship has soured. And again, I don't think it's Harris. I think he's going to be supporting her at the DNC. So to your
Yeah,
point,
but some kind of relationship has soured. Another relationship I could see that being is considering how he was ousted essentially, because like let's
totally.
be honest, he was ousted, and I know some people are like, it's not a coup. I'm like, it's a soft coup. Like he
Yeah.
was basically kind of forced out. Like this could also represent the souring of a relationship with someone else in the party as well. I mean, side-eye Obama. Like
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if there is that souring of that kind of relationship. that's heavily implied in the chart. So
Yeah, no, to your point there too, that is basically his theme for his solar return for next year. And just to briefly touch on that, he's in he goes into an 11th house year on his birthday in November. And this creates so much more context because again, calling the election for me, it was really tight between Biden and Trump. The way that I got clarity around it was Harris, because Harris is looked favorable. And I was very confused by his solar return chart because I thought, okay, well, they're going to win. But his solar return chart shows a lot of challenges and a lot of challenges with his party. And now it's clear that he's going to be processing a lot of his grief next year, I think, because he didn't get to end. He still ended on a high note. People are singing his praises for how he stepped out, for how he
yeah,
put the country before his own desires and things like that. There's other things people are upset with him about for sure, but I think he's going to be processing some grief around um loyalties and the way that things would have ended because he's in an 11th house year next year, which is ruled by this Venus, which is in horrible shape.
that's a very unhappy Venus.
She's in
Ah.
detriment, she's combust, she's in the 12th house. There's a
Hmm.
little bit of a redeeming trine from Jupiter, which helps. That's who I was thinking of, the Jupiter trine. It's
Yeah,
Biden.
the struggle
um
bus Venus, though.
Yeah. So it's rough. And so when we're talking about 11th house issues, like who's on your team, where do I have a sense of belonging and loyalty? He's feeling the struggle there. So if this chart describes the story of his life, this is one way that he's remembered is that his own party asked him to step down.
I
Now,
mean, yeah, his own party asked him to step down. Some of his allies like embarrassed him. I think that will be very much front and center for his next year for sure.
yeah. So I think even just personally, just wish like I think I see him like on inauguration day, like being there, showing up, supporting, but inside he's a little sad. He's mourning something. So those were some things that I was picking up for him. Like his chart, his monthly return around the election looks looks pretty good, but it's the months after that he feels, I think he's processing.
It does. However, I do want to point out that I don't like Mars angular in
Oh,
the
totally.
it's giving leading the troops to war type energy, and I don't like that at all. I'm
No.
gonna be completely honest, especially for the fact that the Sun and Mars are in mutual reception.
Ooh.
I don't like it.
Let's talk about that because you and I were talking a little bit before we started rolling the cameras. And yeah, so Israel has just sent a retaliatory. I didn't get a chance to see everything,
It
the
was an
article had to say,
airstrike.
but
Hmm.
in Lebanon.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm like, that's escalation. Like, it might not escalate now, but looking at all the ingress charts, so the Libra ingress, the Capricorn ingress is also not so great. One common theme all of them have is that Mars is always in a whole sign angle. Mars is always in a whole sign angle, and when you see a chart like that, the potential for war, the potential for violence is very high. So
Yeah.
for the fact that yes, it was true in the original Aries ingress chart for this year, it's been in every chart. Mars has been super angular, and the thing that sucks about I think Mars in the Libra ingress is that Mars is in Cancer, and Mars does not like being in Cancer. So that's going to be an interesting thing to navigate. I believe the Libra ingress is a Libra rising chart. And so not only is Mars angular, it is in the 10th.
Oh,
Like,
wow.
so that's very loud in terms of a conflict
Mhm.
signature.
Yeah, and there's a lot of other things that really back that up. Okay. Like Mars is going to make three oppositions with Pluto. Those are known for being really volatile, brutal. And we saw how that configuration is happening three times over Biden's moon. So that also describes his feelings of embarrassment, basically, and powerlessness over his own body failing him, basically, but
Right.
also all the attacks from everywhere else. But could this also point to his loyalties with Israel and trying to maintain relationship with Israel, but also trying to steer things in a way that is more ethical? You know, you can see him struggling. Like, I think Biden struggles with trying to appease everyone, and Harris at least is being a little bit more outspoken on issues. Like she seems a little bit more willing to take sides, even though she does the Libra thing of also being able to speak to the masses in
Right.
different ways. But, you know, to your point, his moon is in the crossfire of that Mars Pluto, and so his involvement is there. And on top of that, you know, many of us astrologers have been seeing the Uranus return for the United States come down the pipeline. And it's now interesting that our two primary contenders are Gemini Sun and Gemini Rising. So
Hmm.
Kamala Harris is a Gemini Rising. So that Uranus return is happening in her first house. And for those of you that don't know, the Uranus returns for the United States often correspond with our direct involvement in a war.
Yeah, because it's also Mars co-present with Uranus, which is very much giving war.
So you had mentioned on your tweet or your X post
Yeah,
about Kamala being the
Kamala
wartime
being our
president.
wartime president.
Can you elaborate for the people on
Half
that,
shit
please?
post, half not shit post. I with the combination of the fact that in a lot of the ingress charts, Mars is so angular, right? We have a Mars retrograde coming up later this year. Mars retrograde not being good for conflict type things. Mars retrograde also not being great for conflict in general, right? Mars retrograde giving war of attrition type vibes. Yeah. So I was like, okay, that's happening. Just because Kamala has really crazy timing coming up. Um, and I can't help but notice that yes, she does have, so for example, she's wrapping up her Taurus perfection right now. This is a great segue into Kamala, actually.
Yes.
Uh, so by virtue of being in the Taurus year, her 10th house ruler is active, right? And so this is really indicative to me of taking the helm under difficult circumstances, especially because that Jupiter is literally being very, very harmed by a very difficult Saturn, right? That Saturn is overpowered. And so I wouldn't be surprised if, again, some kind of indications around loss or something, especially as it relates to partner, because Jupiter is also saying things about partnerships, put her in positions to exercise more authority, right? I mean, we're quite literally seeing the consequences of that right now. So that to me was
Totally.
like, okay, yeah, something might happen to Joe. Uh, she's also being elevated, but 12th house is also difficult things beyond our control. I mean, like pandemics, like war, like famine, like disaster. Taking the helm under disaster is very much an indication that shows up in her chart, Trump's chart, and Biden's chart. But unlike the other two, where the 10th house ruler is either combust or otherwise harmed by a malefic, hers isn't like yes, hers is harmed by a malefic, but the malefic is one in better shape, and two, she's it's not in the same sign. So like the conjunction is really like doing a lot. When planets are conjunct, I know in the Vedic system it's said to be like planetary war because those planets are like fighting for dominance in that particular domain. Yes, Saturn is casting a ray, Mars is hurling back a ray, but there's some distance, is my point, which is why I was more
Yeah.
comfortable um, suggesting that, okay, maybe she's taking the helm under very difficult circumstances, right?
Well, you know what's interesting about that, Mo, is that, and Dorotheus talks about this, about how when you have planets in combination, in aspect in your natal chart, and then those two planets are doing something by transit, that alone can trigger something really important for you. And
Mm-hmm.
because Jupiter is her time lord still until her birthday, that Mars Jupiter in Gemini alignment that you mentioned, and like shifting of alliances, is going to be really major for her. And what you were talking about, taking the helm under difficult circumstances, I would say that that's also Saturn's transit going through her 10th house,
Mm-hmm.
as well as by progression, her Saturn has also progressed into Pisces, which is weird and strange and something you don't often get to see.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, taking the helm under difficult circumstances. And so I thought, maybe like you thought, that maybe there would be something would happen to Biden. At least he is able, he is left in a way where people are going to praise him for leaving. I was
Mm-hmm.
thinking like there would be something where she had to take over. That's kind of what I was thinking. But what you may be suggesting here is the difficult circumstances may be something on a global level, even.
I think so. I mean, to be fair, we do have like 5 months left in the year. A lot
Yeah.
can happen in 5 months, as we've seen in the last 2 weeks. But yeah, no, I was thinking something more global. Obviously, like the potential for things happening to Joe implied, just because he is also a person represented by Jupiter in her chart. I could again, and I think so. I don't use the outer planets that much in my practice anymore, but for the modern girlies, Uranus is right there. Like, and Uranus will station retrograde and go back over it, right? So there's a lot going on there, essentially, that I think made me think, okay, she would be relevant. All of her other timing promotes this idea that she would be taking the helm of some sort, maybe under not so great circumstances. It's like those situations where I forget what the phenomenon is called in sociology, but it's where women are brought to power in difficult times to clean up everyone's mess and then get scapegoated and blamed for it.
Damn.
So that's more of the vision I had in mind for her.
And I think there's some other things that support that. So, number one, on her birthday, she's going to be moving into a Gemini ruled year,
Hmm.
which makes Mercury her time lord. Now, Mercury's in the sixth house, which often has military connotations with it. Mercury is going to be in the crosshairs of that Mars retrograde.
Uh-huh.
Mars retrograde is going to square that Mercury three different times. Pluto is also there,
Hmm.
also squaring Mercury. So she is going to be feeling that Mars retrograde in a very personal way, something that really impacts her year. On
Hmm.
top of that, being in a Gemini ruled year, certainly she's going to have Jupiter. She's synced up with Jupiter by transit right now. Jupiter is going to do some favorable things, being in the right place at the right time, things kind of going her way, perhaps some sort of like victory or blessing potentially. Trump's getting that Jupiter too. So I just want to throw that in there.
The one
But
thing I will say about the difference between Trump and Kamala is that for Trump, he's not having an activation of either Jupiter or Gemini, because that's what got him the election last time. He had
true.
a Sun Venus conjunction in the perfected house. Like it was loud. I was like, okay, yeah, he's taking the helm. For her, it's like Jupiter has come to the perfected house, right? And Jupiter's angular in the return. Like you can't make it up. And I remember seeing someone comment on oh, Mitt Romney, for example, also Gemini rising, and when he had his 2012 election bid or something, how yeah, Jupiter was going through his first house, but when you looked at what his timing actually was, I believe he was in a Scorpio perfection. and his moon Jupiter in Scorpio was active, right? But if you looked at his solar return, Jupiter was actually in Taurus in his 12th. So
Okay.
yes, Jupiter was somewhat active, but like Gemini as a sign, not super active, right? On top of that, the dude has like the Sun and Mars in the 10th, like as a day chart. Like it's not, that's not like a likability transit. And Mars was his main time lord, right? I think Mars was also doing some funky stuff in 2012. And I think that his downfall was kind of tied more to what Mars was not doing for him than Jupiter also happening to go through his first house. And so I
Got
think for
it.
Kamala, it's different because that first house is super active, right?
It's her sign of the year. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, excellent points there. Yeah, because Jupiter also, like, people think Jupiter's going to answer all their prayers and wishes, and no, it might answer one or two. It doesn't make every wish come true. It might save your ass a couple of times. So it doesn't mean that just because Jupiter is helping out Trump, it doesn't mean that it's enough, basically.
exactly.
Yeah. But
Exactly.
But the one other thing I was just going to say to finish up the thought about what we were just talking about is that her sign of the year is Gemini. Uranus enters Gemini in July. So the
I
Uranus return begins.
I mean, I think we'll be in some kind of conflict way before then, but definitely. Like that is also quite telling in my opinion. I think so yeah, Mercury being her time lord is not in the best house, to be honest. It's definitely
Nope.
not. Um However, like looking at Venus on the ascendant to me was just like okay.
Yeah,
Um Being at the like highly elevated by some kind of group affiliation was kind of prominent to me. Um, I think as well, I'm trying to think about where the 12th part of that midheaven is. I believe the 12th part of the midheaven is actually in her 10th.
it's her 10th. Yeah.
Um, the 12th part of her ascendant is that actually in Capricorn? It's hard to tell from here. I think it is in
I think it
Capricorn.
is. Yeah, it's Capricorn.
So seeing that 12th part in the eighth house situation was like, okay, yeah, lots of difficulty, things around loss and like things that happen in the private and dark, like in the dark, like things like that.
Hmm.
Heavily implied. It's hard to see where Fortune is. I think Fortune's 12th part is actually in Aquarius. It's in the
Aquarius.
ninth. So
Yeah.
again, this is where I thought, okay, the courts, something about the courts and fate being implied. Now it's interesting
Hmm.
that Fortune is not only with Mars, but it's that's her second house. And I know
Hmm.
that, again, the Republicans are planning to challenge her run, her bid, and I wouldn't be surprised
Yes.
if this is a period where, you're being set up for the potential for litigation, right? I mean,
Completely
Jupiter
agree.
is in the seventh. It's also giving that as well, like someone challenging your position in some way, right?
Hmm.
Um, but
Yeah.
yeah,
And Saturn angular here, Saturn angular, for me, that indicates that there's some measure of difficulty in the year ahead. But what it's also speaking to is Saturn's transit. Going back to, again, what we were saying about her taking the helm under difficult circumstances, the pressures of the job. Again, Saturn isn't the planet that, well, Saturn actually is the planet that is going to cause her more challenges, but her natal Saturn is in Aquarius, which helps her out a little bit. So, kind of like Vance with his Mars, like you're getting some things that are really favorable and some things that are really challenging, but you can grow a lot through them if you rise to the challenge. But yeah, this is going to be speaking to her public facing, her profession, her role. Because I do suspect that she'll win. So this would be speaking to some of the challenges of the job, especially if we do get ourselves involved in a more global conflict, the new pressures that she would be facing there right away.
Yeah. It's also looking like someone struggling to unite a bunch of people. Just giving what Jupiter is also doing. I know that one of the jokes that other astrologers who used to predict elections would say is like, look at the chart, and if someone looks like they're moving during election year, there's a lot of fourth house stuff going
Oh,
on that's
yeah.
implied. So I was like,
Oh,
okay,
yeah.
someone's moving somewhere.
Yes.
Uh, I
Yeah.
mean, for the fact that Jupiter is in the seventh, it's like, okay, partner gives you some kind of access to resources. But I think again, like sometimes when things are also in the 12th, there's an element of your life not being your own. And I think that in some ways her life is no longer her own, right?
Yeah.
So
You see a lot of 12th house signatures with presidents and
you do.
people who hold office, and celebrities too, because you can't be yourself in the way that you want to. You your ascendant is your persona. It's not necessarily you. So yeah, but the fourth house connection coming from eclipses, also coming from Mercury as the time lord, also ruling the fourth. Yeah, I agree with you. There's a lot happening for her fourth house that would indicate a move. Um, would her right to the new space be challenged by that Mars retrograde? Yeah, the Mars Pluto opposition. Yeah, that aspect becomes exact with her Mercury right at the election when Mars enters Leo and comes into that first opposition with Pluto. So I think we're going to see challenges right away. They're already teeing up for that.
Oh, definitely. Another thing that, so I do want to go back to the solar return that's currently active right now,
Yeah.
because I think that that solar return also is very indicative of her rise as well. And it would be helpful to look at the monthly charts until like September, because that's the last chart for this particular return. And so this return was very interesting to me because not only was, the midheaven and the 10th house corresponding to her first. So again, focusing on becoming more prominent. Jupiter retaking its oath, again, implying like things around taking the helm under difficult circumstances. The ascendant's 12th part falling in her 12th as well, implying like more of this like uncertainty, lack of control, dealing with foreign elements and things like that. And notice how like now she's commenting more on things publicly, like when something happens, and she's being briefed more on things and stuff like that. So I thought it was interesting that some of that shows up in this particular return as well.
Mhm. Yeah. The ascendant jumping to the 10th house, showing her focus on the White House, basically. That's what it is now, like the focus on her future, her career. And also with Virgo rising in this chart, that's another indicator of private life and home life and potentially even a move, because this will show something that becomes important, something that you weren't necessarily thinking about it in that way. It's something that ends up becoming more important. So yeah, and with Venus in a conjunction with Uranus, it's unplanned for her because she was thinking that Biden was going to continue to run, and I think that she had knowledge of his declining health, and I think that she was prepared for that,
Right.
which is why she had that speech prepared basically immediately after the debate. So there is a Uranian component there with Venus's connection there.
Yeah. So we love Venus angular, that Venus is not happy. And, that's already mapping on to people digging up things about, again, her private life, how she spends her time, who she's dated, her sexual history, lack of children. Um, and that's very much, we're seeing that in play right now.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is still, again, Venus is still one of her main time lords, right? That Jupiter, Mars, Saturn, we're going to see a lot more slandering of her on the basis of she's not a woman who decided to have kids. She's someone who's been involved with very powerful people in her romantic past, even though respectfully, that's none of our business. Like, so I think a lot of those attacks will continue, unfortunately. Um, because she is a night chart, and yes, Venus not having a great time is not great, but it's almost like when people do slander her, like it's not having the effect that it's supposed to have, right?
No.
It's not really landing like it would otherwise. So I think that it's kind of working to her advantage for now.
Well, it's interesting because now you have basically two Geminis in the ring. And Trump was like the king of insults, and she's able to throw it right back, not in the same style, but this whole discourse around calling Republicans weird right now, or Trump supporters weird,
Hmm.
it's really taken off. And it just makes me think about how she's a Gemini. Like she can do the branding as well.
I mean, she's also got a third deck in Mars. Like, I mean, and I would argue that the third decan of Libra compared to the first two, not afraid to like take the bar to hell if you need to, right? Eye for an eye, make it entertaining.
Yeah.
So she's able to sort of tap into that same place because of some of the interesting similar connections, and they're both like full moon charts with the sect light in the 11th house. So that's another parallel between them that's really fascinating, and it'll be interesting to see who's going to win out or not, right?
Yeah.
Uh, so the interesting thing about Kamala is that her lots for that solar return that's active right now, um, her lot of burden is actually in the 12th house, right?
Yeah.
But ironically, her lot of assistance is in the 11th. So I think her being to able to tap into the mega donations is having that sect light in the 11th house be the second house ruler, having that third deck in Mars in Leo, like really tapping into the propaganda machine and printing the dollars. Like, I mean, that shows up in this return as well, considering that Mars is overpowered in this chart and it rules the eighth, like literally campaigning and getting people to hand over their money. Like,
Yeah.
it's very loud.
I do think, and I'll just say, just like based on the storyline we're thinking about with her legitimacy on the ticket and taking the donations coming into question, I believe, by
Mhm.
the Trump Vance ticket, because they've already filed grievances of such. In her solar return, the lot of victory is associated with her ninth house. So I think that that's an indication that she doesn't have to worry about that as much. It is going to be a lot of noise and
Mhm.
distraction, but I don't think she'll ultimately have to worry about it. But I think it'll be a headache, but I think she'll persevere and overcome it. But speaking of the lots, we've got a lot of fortune in Gemini. I think we talked about that in our last video, being
Mhm.
important that certain events bring her presence forward,
Mhm.
and that importance there. So, and where that's connected to is the 12th part is the her natal 12th, which is the derived sixth from the seventh. So the health of Biden pushed her forward into the spotlight, which is
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. It's very fascinating. I do want to look at her chart for August and September because I
Okay.
think those are going to be the critical charts to look at.
All right.
Um,
All right. So she is in a 10th house month for August, ruled by Jupiter.
oh
And
yeah.
yeah, so Jupiter is, yeah, it's in Gemini, it's in her natal first house, but we've got the whole Mars, Saturn, Venus story going on here. And this is the
Yeah.
DNC right here. Like this is right after, I
Right
believe.
after the
Yeah.
DNC. Looking at this again and seeing like what's going on in terms of running mate type stuff. I mean, I do think that people will ultimately fall in line behind the party. However, I do think that her choice of running mate will alienate a certain proportion of people.
Mm-hmm.
I think that regardless of who she picks, there are a lot of people who might not be happy with it. Like, So that's very much obvious. And obviously, there's a subset of the Democratic Party and people adjacent. So I heard that, and I don't know how true this is, Bernie Sanders, for example, is not like uniting behind her, for example. Organizations like Black Lives Matter and some other groups that care about certain parts of what would be the Democratic agenda or parts of the Democratic agenda that are overlapping with the activities of those groups are like kind of resistant to the idea of her even taking the helm, even though essentially the party has like pretty much made her the person.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if there is also a campaign to sort of like push back against her as a nominee. And just thinking about what I was saying about the potential for the US to get involved in some foreign conflicts. I mean, we still have Ukraine going on, which is a whole other can of worms. Like the potential for escalation between Israel and Lebanon. Like, I mean, these are things that could probably make things go, but Mars is separating, so like I think the peak of that is over, but I do think that
Mhm.
the frustration is very much lingering with people.
Yeah. Yeah. And, Venus is still her time lord. So for Venus to be in this crossfire here, like that is definitely not easy.
No.
And the 12th house being hidden enemies as well and hidden agendas and things like that. So, yeah, I think you're correct to assume that there may be some opposing force to be handled here. Because also, like her natal Venus is in the crossfires too. Like her natal
Mhm.
Venus is right here in Virgo. Like
Yeah.
it's, yeah, 17 degrees Virgo. So her natal Venus, her time lord, is also being assaulted.
So it's interesting because like I know that like people are again digging into her past, digging into her family life. Something that comes to mind is like her stepchildren, for example, and the things going on with them. Like I could see that becoming cannon fodder for like whatever opposition there is. Her past as a prosecutor, things like
Mhm.
that. And so do I think it's enough to stop her momentum, considering that Mars is separating from Jupiter? Um, Fortune is ruled by Jupiter, and the moon is looking at Fortune. I don't think it's going to be enough to stop her.
Yeah,
Uh,
I
will it
don't
feel
think so
good?
either.
No, it's not gonna be like the best. It's not gonna feel the best for her. However, I do see that Mercury Sun conjunction is pretty close to her natal Mars. And so I do think that there's something that she will be doing that will again speak to people coalescing behind a mandate, right?
Yeah.
Because it's like, okay, we really something is on the line and we have to fight for it.
Hmm.
And she's kind of sticking
Yeah,
her neck out, like, hey, okay, make me your punching bag, but we got to roll up our sleeves and fight the fight. So,
totally. Yeah. And Sun is on the angle, which is really strong. I think that that's really favorable for a 10th house month. Also, like the energy of the month, Gemini, like there's an overload of information. This is like a very busy news cycle. Lots happening locally, following the DNC, following what's going on in the world. It's a little bit chaotic with Gemini being like the energy of the month. But the 12th part also connecting with her ninth house. So again, we're seeing more ninth house themes, whether that's litigation, whether that's Supreme Court, whether it's someone challenging her in the courts, whether it's, foreign affairs. There's some sort of importance there. And, speaking of foreign affairs with Mars right on the ascendant, that definitely doesn't look easy. But right, not going to stop her. Fortune is ruled by Jupiter, which is nice. And the moon is in the 10th house, which is also nice. I think it has some distance from Saturn, but it will
yeah.
eventually get to Saturn. But within the moon's range, it for me, what I look at, I kind of stop short of Mars. It kind of lands on Venus for me. So
Yeah.
I would say all in all, some prickly things to move through, but I think some things are coming through to support.
Yeah, I think Fortune in the seventh looks a lot like the weight of Joe's endorsement,
Yeah.
things like that. I could see maybe that Mars and the Ascendant having the 12th part in the ninth, also pushing more for the court reform as well,
Yeah.
and including that more in the platform to mobilize people. Whether it's an
Totally.
effective strategy or not remains to be seen, but I won't be surprised if they do campaign on that because to be honest with you, it's a pretty, I mean, that's probably one of the few things that people across the political spectrum agree on. Like the courts need to be reformed, period, right?
Yeah.
And opening that Pandora's box is I think it's both. This is where I talk about like the potential for some of these things to both be beneficial and backfire. So I would argue that yes, Democrats, great that you want to reform the courts, but remember, you are opening Pandora's box. These things can also work against you if you're not careful.
Yes.
So, and then we come to September.
September. Okay, this one looks a little crunchier.
So this is actually right after the Pisces eclipse, but before the Libra eclipse, right? And
Hmm.
so if we think about where the eclipses are hitting Kamala, so her sect light is Aries moon.
Hmm.
The eclipse is 12th from her moon. The 12th part of that eclipse is in Capricorn, um, which is her eighth house. And so I'm like, that is a 10th house eclipse for her, but there's a lot of eighth house, 12th house stuff. So that's another reason why
Ooh.
I was like, she's going to become more prominent than she would probably like to be sometime in this September, October timeframe,
Yeah.
which may also make people have questions about her role, the election, right? Because some people in the Republican Party are like, Joe should step down if he's not fit. But then you have some people saying, no, they're just installing her. Like, so I think that that may also come into play. Um,
Interesting.
what are your thoughts about the Moon Mars mutual reception going on in this chart?
Yeah, I definitely noticed that as well. Well, the thing that kind of stands out for me is that okay, so she's in an 11th house month where her natal moon
Hmm.
in Aries is. And so there's like a little bit of a lunar return going on there. It's
Uh-huh.
almost to the degree, I think.
Yeah,
Let's
it's
see
almost to the
here.
degree. It's like a degree off.
Yeah. So there's something important about that. And the moon in the 11th house saying things about her connections with her party, her followers, and there is an opposition with Venus, which I would still mark as favorable. However, look at this Pluto. So there is some difficulty that the moon is experiencing as it moves into this square with Pluto. But then following the arc of the moon, it will move into Taurus where things do get a little bit more favorable and beneficial. So I do see like a vibe change a little bit into the month, but things really look stressful at the beginning, especially when you consider Mars on the ascendant, when you consider fortune in Mars's sign. So there's
Hmm.
there's some really big challenges. Some and like Mars for her, yeah, I mean, I feel like whether you want to say attacks or things that she needs to confront or people confronting her, stuff that isn't easy to deal with.
You know, when I saw Mars in the first house in Cancer, I thought of Meghan Markle's chart instantly and how people slander her left and right, like it's their job,
Mm-hmm.
and they're obsessed
Mm-hmm.
with it. They're obsessed with her, everything they do. But it's interesting how, despite that, for the fact that Mars has triplicity, especially in a night chart as like the dominant triplicity lord, you have your sort of stands who like will ride or die for you, right? And
Yeah.
so this does feel to me like more contention around her role. Um, because the 10th whole sign house ruler is in the first, I'm like, authority is again coming to you under difficult circumstances, but said authority is contested, heavily contested. Doubling down on that for the fact that the moon and Mars are in mutual reception. Like, there's that she's seeking authority, authority comes to her, right? The
Mm-hmm.
moon is going to have a dignity change, which also points to more elevation. And so now I'm wondering, for the people who want Joe to step down, will you get your
Oh
wish? Like, and what does that mean?
my God.
Because I could see, yeah,
Could that be all the ninth house stuff?
yeah, and them, going to the courts or this, that, and the third. Like, it feels like some kind of elevation of her, not because she wants to be elevated, people being very mad about it, and her having to get more involved in something that may involve conflict. Um,
Hmm. Interesting.
yeah.
That gives me so many questions because if she is elevated from within, then what happens to her VP pick? Because the vice president would be the Speaker of the House.
And that would create problems in itself because the Speaker of the House is a Republican. So, yeah, that would
Oh,
create lots of problems. And
that would be
so,
weird.
I mean, look at the fact that the midheaven is ruled by that uh Jupiter who's slowing down, not stationary yet, but slowing down, and Saturn is also again in the ninth house on the midheaven. So sometimes I see some kind of blockage. Other times I see someone putting burdens on your shoulders, right? And so this could be some kind of blockage to something she's trying to do. Another thing that I could see is, again, if something is not right with Joe or taking more responsibility. I mean, she made a remarks about her meeting with Netanyahu, and you had a bunch of people going, "Where's Joe? Where's Joe? Is she secretly running the country?" Like, people were upset about it.
I've wondered that actually, like for months.
Yeah. So, like,
But like
again,
she can't say it right now because
yeah,
she needs to be supporting him and everything like that. So, yeah.
yeah, I don't know. But this does look like her being on the defensive, right? And her being put in positions of authority that some people feel like maybe she didn't work hard enough for, right?
Mhm.
And people having opinions about it. Uh,
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, that Moon Pluto thing is certainly not easy and could imply some sort of power dynamic there.
mhm.
The 12th part of the ascendant connects to the second house. So again, we're seeing themes with finances. Could that be connected to the funds that her party, like her campaign, has just inherited from Joe's campaign? And
Yes.
again, I just see there being a lot of attention toward
Hmm.
that technicality. I mean, her name is on the ticket, so but we'll see. We'll see what happens.
So I do
Now,
want to close out on this note
yeah, yeah.
because the Libra eclipse is active during this month, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is seventh from her natal moon partnership. The 12th part falls in Aquarius, ninth house, courts. I personally think something happens with Joe. She has to take
Wow.
more responsibility, and the courts are somehow involved. Like, I don't know, people being upset about it, like the potential for something of that nature, or like, a lot of people wanting to invoke, what is it, the 25th Amendment. Like, I'm
Yeah.
wondering if is like because between that 10th house eclipse and then this Libra eclipse implying a lot about partnership, things like that, I'm wondering if she has to take the helm right before the election.
Well, Mercury returns to her natal Venus there, and there's a lot of this Saturn opposition stuff, and Saturn opposing her Time Lord on her natal Venus, like from the 10th house. There's a lot to be said there, even just by transit, like transiting Saturn opposite her Time Lord Venus. And yeah, I mean, that also what you were saying about Uranus going back over her Jupiter, I think, is that kind of around this time? I guess it's getting
I think it
closer.
would have just stationed.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think you're right to that we
Oh,
should keep our pulse on that.
this
Mm-hmm.
is not good because if what I'm saying is possibly correct, and we're in a situation where she technically becomes president and technically what's his face becomes vice president, that creates like a situation we probably have not been in like in a long time, if ever, right?
No.
And, the VP is in charge of overseeing the Senate, right? And they certify the election results.
Wow.
Oh yeah, no.
Okay. And
This
I
is
know we
messy.
I know we have to wrap things up, but that makes me think about the month of April and how April is looking to have a lot of activity. So something like that might cause long, long delays. So let's put a pin in it for now. Let's see what happens just following the DNC, and then you and I will reconvene. I did want to share Kamala's progressed lunation cycle.
Share it right now
Really
because
cool.
we got to see it.
Oh, wait, do we have time?
We can. I'm just gonna let my client know that I'm a little late.
Okay. How much time do we have?
Let me message her actually.
Okay. I'll pull that up really quick. And I'm going to post a clip of this separately. So for those of you who are interested in seeing a deeper dive into what I'm about to share, you can check that out. It's a clip from 2021 where I'm talking about this. So it's a little spooky to go back and see. But if you trace Kamala Harris's progressed lunation cycle back to her progressed new moon, which happened over here in Sagittarius in 2011, in a square with Venus, Pluto, and Uranus. And this means she seeded a 30-year cycle around that time that is going to carry the energies of this configuration over here. Now we've got Venus, which rules her fifth house. So her stance on reproduction, on reproductive freedoms and creating freedoms for people. And also just the Uranian signature alone describes like shattering glass ceilings, which she has done repeatedly at major turning points in this progressed lunation cycle. So it was around this progressed new moon that she decided to run for attorney general, and she won, becoming the first woman of color to hold this seat as well. Then at her progressed square, so the moon would have been over here in Pisces,
Mm-hmm.
she runs for like a seat opens in the Senate and she runs and she gets it. So again, becoming like the first in many ways there as well. Then,
Uh, I'm just fascinated by that progressed moon in Cancer right now.
yeah, well, here at the Gibbous, she becomes vice president. So with the progressed moon in Taurus. So I was just thinking, like, well, what comes next at the full moon? So we had the full moon in late Gemini over here. So we're still in this full moon phase. And that is typically something that where you see like a fullness of one's aspirations that were seeded back in 2011. So she keeps pushing herself forward. So I would think that like securing the seat of commander in chief would be highly probable. I think it's very supportive of that. There are other things in her secondary progressions that stand out in a very big way. Like for example, Uranus has stationed, Pluto is stationing. These are really big deal things. And Joe Biden is also experiencing progressed Uranus stationing right now too. So these are life-changing stations that we'll see. So I could see
Mhm.
their charts are very much connected. And I've mentioned that before, but there's something about the timing of their charts being very much synced up. And not to mention, okay, one last thing about this full moon and the progressed new moon, they were eclipses.
Oh,
So so yeah,
oh,
they're progressed eclipses.
that's crazy.
And those I've seen have bigger ripple effect on the collective. Like Britney Spears had a progressed full moon, and now everyone knows what a conservatorship is.
Yeah, I mean, even for the fact that Kamala has, so she's one of those rare people that gets to have the chart ruler by progression interact with her natal lot of fortune
Yeah.
and spirit, and
Yeah.
Mercury's just hanging out there.
It's headed for it.
Um, it's interesting because Venus also looks like it just ingressed into Sag
Sag. Yep.
recently.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Yeah. So that brings a change in relations. And obviously, if the higher you climb, the more that impacts your relationships. They
Wait, that
change a
looks like
lot.
it just like moved within the last couple weeks, that Venus.
Within the last year.
The
Within the
last year?
last year.
Okay.
Yeah,
Because that's like fresh.
it is. Yeah, but some other things have happened. There was a Mercury Cazimi by progression on the South Node. Like, I mean, there's a lot of things to look at in her progressions. It's kind of insane.
No, that's quite fascinating. And we're gonna have to sit with this one, but I think for the fact that by progression, the progressed moon, do not sleep on the progressed moon because those dignity changes are palpable. I mean, she's
Mm-hmm.
got the progressed moon in domicile right now,
Yeah.
coming off of an eclipse. So I don't know. It's giving like reaping the fruits of whatever identity change you went through, right? And going to the next phase, right?
Mm-hmm.
Since that
Yeah.
because it's going to transition into the disseminating moon, right?
Yeah.
That's where you start to sort of like reap the fruits of your labor. It's like, okay, the grapes are plump now. Let's make wine,
You're
right?
done climbing, but you get to do the thing that you have worked so hard. Like it's like you first begin to go down the mountain again, like it feels good.
Yeah, so
You feel accomplished.
that's interesting. I think this is a great note to close on, but looking at her chart, I think like after the DNC, once we know like her partner, we should really sit down with those charts between October and January because for
Yes.
all of the people involved, like those
Yeah.
charts look really stressful,
Oh,
not
I
gonna
know.
lie.
I know. Okay. So, yeah, we'll meet again in a few weeks and we'll dive into the intensity of the election season, going through that Mars retrograde in Cancer and Leo to the inauguration. We'll see what the astrology can tell us. So, Mo, thank you for doing another deep dive with me.
Of course, no, this is fun. And I mean, I do want to comment, because I've been talking about this with people recently, like, um, really just trust what the astrology is telling you, but also be open to like different ways that the same significators can play out, right? Because as the last few weeks have been showing us all, like a lot can happen. And sometimes, like, yes, you were kind of like in the realm of what this could mean, but you didn't realize it would be that crazy. So
Yeah.
I have like suspended my disbelief for this election because I feel like it's just going to get progressively weirder.
Yes. So trust the chart, be humble, but also trust your interpretation skills. And yeah, just knowing that your interpretation is going to shift based on how the terrain is going to shift. So you can modify it accordingly. So we'll have to see what these next couple of months bring. And until then, you can find us online. Mo, where can everyone find you? What are your handles?
I'm literally Austral Tour everywhere, Twitter, Instagram, Substack. That's where I hang out these days. So
Do you have a website?
my website is down right now. I need to reconfigure it. So stay tuned for when that relaunches, but that's probably going to happen post Mars retrograde. Like, yeah.
Understandable. All right. And I'm Astro Catherine on all platforms. I'm not the most active on all my social media right now because I got two little kids. But you can book readings with me. I'm at catherineurban.com. So that's what I spend the most of my time doing now is being a mom and then doing consultations. So, and obsessing about the election right now. That's the other
Yes,
thing. Yeah.
exactly. So we will be in touch and let's do this again soon.
All right, Mo, have a great rest of your night. Bye,
Okay, you too.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks so much for tuning in with me today. For more astrology in your world, you can connect with me on all platforms at Astro Catherine. You can also head on over to my website, catherineurban.com, where you can book your next astrology reading. We'll go into depth into your natal chart, your progressions, your perfections, your solar return, your transits, and beyond. You can also join my mailing list where you can stay up to date with me on new classes as well as article drops. I look forward to connecting with you, and I'll see you next time.